Hello and welcome to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. We have hit December and the regular season is still going on. It's getting bumpy, but the finish line of this college football season is almost in sight. My guest this week to talk about this later than usual stretch run is Ross Dellenger from Sports Illustrated. This is LSU-Alabama week, and it's amazing what different states these two programs are in since the Tigers broke through and beat the Tide last year. We'll talk about LSU's regression and Alabama's almost boring brilliance. The most interesting part of the playoff race has become, will Ohio State play enough games? Ross and I will talk about the Big Ten's football season, which has become one long headache. Plus, who is the front runner for the Heisman Trophy? Even though the odds say one thing, I think Ross and I think another thing. And is Tom Herman's time at Texas coming to an end? And will it lead to a return to college football for Urban Meyer? Thanks for listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. You can find us on Westwood One Podcast, Apple Podcasts, just about anywhere you like to get your podcast. If you like what you hear, give us a good review and a good rating. It helps college football fans find us, and it helps us find more college football fans, and away we go. Joining me this week on the podcast is my friend Ross Dellenger from Sports Illustrated. Wanted to bring Ross on this week because even though it's not a big LSU-Alabama week, it is LSU-Alabama week. And Ross, cut his teeth as a beat writer for LSU and has great sources in LSU and Alabama and really knows these programs. So I figured it was a good time to catch up with Ross for that and some other things. So Ross, thanks very much for joining me this week on the show.
Yeah, no problem, Ross.
LSU-Alabama a year ago was, well, not in the playoff rankings, but in the AP rankings, a 1-2 game. It was the game of the century. And a year later, you could hardly recognize where LSU is. So let's start there. I think it's very interesting to see what's happened a year later with these programs. And again, you have a lot of intimate knowledge with LSU. We all expected some regression at LSU this year. Were you at all at any way thinking that it could have gotten this bad at LSU this year after all the attrition?
Well, like you said, I think we all expected a dip. And in fact, I remember when the preseason AP poll came out, LSU was like 4 or 5 or 6, somewhere in there. And I remember thinking, you have got to be kidding me. And I know why voters did that, obviously, reigning national champion. But to me, I would have been shocked, even during preseason, if LSU would have finished the year in the top 15. I thought this was going to be a 6-4, 7-3 at best type season. And I never, ever would imagine that LSU would be staring right down the barrel at a 3-7 and maybe at best 4-6 season. That's what it looks like it's going to happen. And the big thing is, again, obviously we knew they're going to lose a lot of players. I think they lost 18 of the 22 starters from that national championship team. It's just wild when you lump in some opt-outs and things like that. In fact, somebody from LSU sent me a list of the 55, I think, guys who played in that championship game, or maybe played against Alabama last year, actually. Mm-hmm. They sent it to me yesterday. And so it was like 55 guys. And I think maybe 20 of the 55 remain on the team. 10 of the 20 start now. But it's just, the numbers are just wild. I mean, they just lost so much, and not just from players, but obviously from the staff too. And you see what now staff members are doing. You got the head coach at Baylor, who was the LSU defensive coordinator, and then Carolina Panthers offensive coordinator, who was pass game coordinator at LSU. And then what people seem to forget is LSU lost 3 really important analysts to Power 5 programs, to position jobs at Power 5 programs. So they really lost a ton. So you knew it was coming, but I just never could have thought this. And it's defensively is the most shocking part. I've never quite seen, and they've been playing better late, but I've never quite seen an LSU defense through the first 5 games or so of this season play like that. I mean, you have to go back decades, I think, to find that. And really, statistically, you got to go. You can't go back far enough. It is statistically the worst defense that in the history of LSU football. It's crazy.
So there's a temptation because, listen, the attrition alone probably gives a pretty good explanation of why things are where they are. But I think there's also a temptation to sort of look under the hood and say, was there some culture issues here? Guys like Jamar Chase saying, you know what, I'm out, before the season and opting out. Was there something in the way Orgeron was running the program? Now he's going to take a ton of heat for the Bo Pelini hiring, and that might be something he needs to fix in the offseason, which is, amazing because they paid Bo Pelini a lot of money. But again, you're pretty familiar with the program still, even though you're not on the beat. Is there something under the hood that maybe people are talking about, LSU fans are worried about, that makes them wonder if Orgeron maybe, played something wrong here or did something wrong beyond just lose a lot of players and coaches?
Yeah, right. Definitely. Absolutely. That is a topic of conversation down there. And it's mostly a topic because of the amount of opt-outs the amount of in-season opt-outs from players. I think they're up to around 8 LSU opt-outs. And I don't know if that leads the nation or know how that stacks up, but I would guess it's really high up there. And they've had, I think, 3 or 4 mid-season. So it's a real issue there. You talk to other coaches who watch LSU defensively specifically, and the first thing that I think comes to their mind when they watch LSU play is, man, it just doesn't look like they're giving a lot of effort. And that obviously is calls into question the culture and the attitude and the motivation within the program. So from talking to people down there, that is 100% a topic of conversation. And I'll point you back to the summer where every program dealt with the social justice issue, and programs dealt with it differently. And some coaches dealt with it. Coaches dealt with it in very different ways. Some of them stepped in it, as we all know. We saw Mike Gundy and maybe Mike Norvell, some of their players calling them out. We saw a little bit of that in Baton Rouge. It didn't get as much play because I don't think players were as blunt about it. But LSU players gathered for a march in, I believe, late July or early August, and their coach wasn't with them, and he later joined them with the athletic director. So I think we could look back there and we could point to some of the things that happened over the summer for sure, as far as when you talk about culture and the whole togetherness and the motivation behind playing. And it wasn't long after all of that, social justice type stuff, that you had a couple of really big opt-outs that are, could be the difference between a win and a loss. In Jamar Chase and Tyler Shelvin, the big nose tackle, and of course the receiver that'll be probably a first-round pick.
Yeah, again, it's hard to quantify that stuff. And as a person who is sort of sabermetrically inclined, I always hedge to or hesitate to try to quantify it and try to make here's the reason why. Because again, the most important thing is losing a lot of talent, man. And they just lost a boatload of talent. And then, of course, they also have Miles Brennan get hurt. So that the one side of the ball that they probably could have relied on to be a little more productive, even though they lost a lot of offensive players early in the year, the offense seemed to have obviously it's not going to be as good as it was last year, but between Brennan and Terrace Marshall, there was a chance that could have at least sort of carried them along, and it did in a couple of games. And then Brennan gets hurt, and it looks like Finley has some upside, and the other kid is Max Johnson, if I remember correctly. But clearly they didn't want to be playing those players this year. Is there any thought that, sometimes when you have a season like this and everything goes awry, well, you're getting your younger players some exposure and some reps and maybe developing them in a way that maybe you didn't think you were going to if you had been in contention. As you sort of survey this game a little bit and know the LSU, roster, is there any kind of a silver lining for LSU in that, hey, maybe we're going to get an idea of it, whether it's Finley or Johnson next year. Maybe we're going to get some kids in there who were freshmen who we didn't think we were going to play, who will be now set to launch and be really good next year.
Well, sure. And I think that can always be the case when you have, when you have an injury to a starter and the backups come in and start playing, or when you have players opt out and you have to see the backups come in, is that they're getting certainly getting those reps, those game reps that are so essential. And you look to next year, and I do expect Miles Brennan to come back next season. But if he doesn't, or if something happens, you have some game reps for Finley, quite a bit of game reps for Finley, and you have some for Max Johnson. Finley has proven to me that he certainly has the talent. He's got a rocket of an arm, and we've seen that. But obviously, it's pretty clear as a true freshman, he, mentally probably isn't ready, and it's something that I'm sure LSU enjoys, that he's getting these reps to get more mentally ready. And the same can be said for some of the other spots. Backup receivers had to play with Jamar out, and now Terrace Marshall opts out, and so you can have more receivers, wideouts play a little bit. You've had that same stuff happen on the defensive line. You have young players, so yeah, I think there's some silver lining in the rapid maturation process of these young players looking at next year. Because Ralph, being down in Mississippi and covering the SEC, how fan bases can be. LSU is less than a year removed from winning a national title and maybe putting together one of the best seasons in college football history. And you already, of course, hear the rumblings of Ed Orgeron just signed, by the way, a new 6-year deal with a fairly big buyout, I believe. So you automatically hear the rumblings. And so you look to next season of, man, if they do end up 3-7 or 4-6 this year, boy, next year seems to be really important. And so for these players getting the time on the field this season in kind of a throwaway type year, it's big. It's big for next season, which is really consequential. And so, yeah, I think there's a silver lining there for sure.
Yeah. So that was, I'll let you elaborate on that and then we'll move on. And that was my next question of how much credibility has Orgeron burned through? I mean, that seems crazy, honestly. Like, it seems mad, right? Because he did a nice job, not just last year, but also building toward last year, right? It should be a season like this, while it goes on your permanent record. It should also, you would think, be something thought of a little bit of an anomaly. COVID, boy, that stinks, but we'll go get him next year, Coach O. But that's just not the way the SEC works anymore, especially the top tier of the SEC, where like one bad season is just simply is going to drive some people to panic. So yeah, I guess, I'll leave it at that. Like, how much credibility do you think Coach O has burned? Well, not just through the fan base, but how about like the people who matter more, the boosters and maybe even Scott Woodard, the athletic director?
Well, you got to remember a few things. First of all, you mentioned Woodward there. He didn't hire Ed Orgeron, and Ralph, as well as anybody, that when you have a coach who we have an AD who comes in as relatively new and did not hire that coach, it's just a little different than having an AD who hired that coach. You can imagine having a boss, having a change, whoever your boss is, and having that person change. It's a lot of times probably not great for you. And I think that's the case we see a lot in college football as ADs come in and you'll see they'll make a very sudden or quicker than normal change. Not to say Scott's going to do that, but it's something to keep in mind that he didn't hire at Orgeron. As far as the fans and the boosters down there, we all have to go back to 3 or 4 years ago when LSU basically offered the job to Tom Herman, and he decided to go to Texas, and they fell back to Ed Orgeron. At that point, there were a lot of fans and boosters that certainly thought it wasn't the right decision. They got pointed to Ed Orgeron's record at Ole Miss and all that. But what he did, as you mentioned, he built up the program. He did with great recruiting and some great hires on the staff. And he got to the point where they put together a great season. And we always, we have to keep that in mind. But I think those boosters and those fans who said 3 or 4 years ago this was the wrong move, it's very easy for them to say, see, this is a one-year wonder. See, we told you. And I think that's some of what's going on down there.
And that, of course, everything at LSU and a lot of other programs in the SEC and the SEC West is viewed through the prism of Alabama. And I realize, Ross, coming into this, interview with you, I just don't talk about Alabama a lot on this podcast, which sounds crazy because they're the best team in the country, but they're boring in their greatness, right? Like we just have come to the point where we assume Alabama will be great. And then when they are great, it's not news. So I found myself thinking, I got to talk about Alabama this week because they're, I hate to say like this is the best Alabama team because it's almost impossible. They're almost indistinguishable at this point. And to say like this team is better than last year's team when this year's team has 2 first-round draft pick wide receivers and last year's team had 4. So it's impossible to sort of make those comparisons. But I will say this offense is playing like last year's LSU offense, and we thought that might be a once-in-a-lifetime offense. It is remarkable where Alabama is. I guess what I'd ask you, Ross, is are you at all surprised at where Alabama is right now offensively, that they could repeat what they were doing with Tua and the extra receivers now with Mac Jones, who has been a brilliant player, but is probably not the prospect Tua is? It's just, I don't know. I don't even know if I have a question here as much as to say like, holy crap, Alabama.
Yeah. Same old same, right? This never changes. They've been now, we're going on, 4 to 5, 6 years running of them having this, juggernaut of an offense. Even way back, 6, 7 years ago, when Kiffin was there and they kind of changed and went to the spread. They didn't have they weren't putting up the points necessarily they are now, but they still were so fun to watch and always were creative and scored a good amount of points. And it's just evolved into a situation where no matter who the players are now, they're just pieces that fit into the puzzle that is this, explosive offense year in and year out. It's incredible. And I did not expect anything like this. But I covered the Georgia-Alabama game, and I remember talking to some Alabama staff members after that game, and they just acted so like shrug. We knew this was coming. We've seen Mac Jones in practice like for 2-3 years. He knows the system. He sees the field. We knew it. And he's surrounded by these 5-star players and these great athletes. So, but I'm still, I catch myself, and I shouldn't, being shocked. I mean, I remember, being at that Georgia-Alabama game, and Alabama's explosive enough that within 60 seconds they can go from trailing by 4 points to leading by 10. And that's exactly what happened. It's crazy. And they've got another, Heisman Trophy candidate at quarterback and a stud running back. And first-round receivers and a defense that starting to show signs of Alabama of old, I guess, in a way. But it's really been incredible to watch. But I think it speaks to a lot of the evolution of football in general and where we are in the game.
So two quick things. One quick thing on the defense is, and I wrote about this last week in my sort of wrap up Saturday night column, is that, listen, we should never be surprised that Alabama's got talent, right? I mean, they're all talented players. Okay, I want to interrupt you just for a second, Ross, because it's kind of weird to do breaking news on a podcast because this is recorded. But just so my listeners and our listeners can understand when this is recorded, some pretty significant news just came in literally as I'm talking to Ross, so I wanted to cut him off. And that is this statement from Ohio State Department of Athletics. The Ohio State University football team will resume organized team activities this afternoon being Tuesday, in preparation for its game Saturday against Michigan State in East Lansing, Michigan. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that Ohio State is definitely playing this weekend, but it means they very well could be playing this weekend, and that's definitely a positive sign. We will get to more of Ohio State. I want to finish up our Alabama conversation first. Part of it, the two more things I wanted to ask you was the defensive part. Listen, we know Alabama's got talent, right? They always have 4 and 5 star kids. So there's never a question that eventually they will have a bunch of NFL guys on their offense or on their defense. It has been interesting to me to see them sort of come along, and some of these kids who, we hadn't necessarily heard about are becoming impact players, and Christian Miller, and I guess Tim Smith is one of the kids up front, and some of these D-backs. Malachi Moore is a freshman who looks like the next big star player in the defensive backfield. So they haven't played the best of competition over the last few weeks, but without question, they have looked more like an Alabama defense. I guess if nothing else, it probably takes Pete Golding off the hot seat, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah, because there were times certainly last year where they really looked rough, and then there were times earlier this season where they did. But it's all starting to come together at the right time. I was on in an LSU Baton Rouge-based radio station earlier this week, and I said those exact words. Boy, Alabama's offense is humming like always and better than ever, and the defense is coming around at the right time. And, the host, who is a former LSU football player, said, yeah, great, just perfect time,
Was that T-Bob?
Heading to Baton Rouge. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
So, right. Former LSU center. So, yeah, it's all seeming to come together, peaking at the right time with the tide, and it always seems to be that case. So
I hate to sometimes make these judgments on a person's personality when you see them for 5 to 10 minutes on a Zoom or a 3-minute television interview. But let me see if you're seeing the same things as I am. I feel like Nick Saban has been, again, from the interactions through Zoom interviews and, press conferences and just seeing him on TV, has been remarkably, I'm trying to figure out what the word is here, like mellow. I don't know if mellow is the right word. Remarkably calm. In some ways, almost like he just seems to be rolling with it this year. I've noted like he made some jokes after the after the Auburn game, where the Iron Bowl, where he wasn't allowed to be on the sideline, and even leading into it. Like, are you noticing anything from seeing Saban that suggests that, I don't know, like in a year where you'd think that he would be as or more intense than usual because of all these things that are going on around him that are not in his control, that he's learned to sort of like say, going to be okay with that. We have good people in place, and as long as everything works out, I'm going to be okay. Have you noticed or sensed any of that, or is that me just projecting because I'm looking for a story?
No, I have. I've sensed it, and I've been sensing it. For the last like couple of seasons, but I do notice this year he just is calmer, and maybe this is something that maybe it's part of just, I hate to say it, but getting older, and I think he obviously is about to hit, I think he just turned 69. Yep. So he's getting close to, that 70 mark, and he's just getting older. And I've seen it the last few years. I think he's steadily grew calmer and calmer and even more understanding with the media. But specifically this year, I agree. It does seem like he's even been calmer and more mellow than normal. And I think maybe it's just an evolution of Nick Saban. Now, I will say he hasn't been he has been calmer on the sidelines than he was 5 years ago, but man, he still does seem to get seem to go crazy, have little bursts of anger on the sideline. There's still that intensity there, but for sure, in press conference settings and in Zooms and stuff, he does seem to be real calm. And I know you've probably sat down with Nick in the past and just face to face, whatever, one-on-one opportunities. And I've only done it once. It was 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, I guess, at the SEC spring meetings, and just me and him in a room. And gosh, I remember coming away with, man, that is not what I expected.
Yeah, that's absolutely the case. Yeah,
he was so calm and really, really soft-spoken, and almost walked out of the room with me really gingerly, old man-y. It was weird to see. So he can be that way, and I think with age, I think it's an evolution. But this year, I've noticed it even more.
He is a little friendlier in one-on-one situations than you might think he would be, considering his public persona. When you sit down with him one-on-one, and I know this sounds like a small thing, that why is that notable? But not all coaches do this. You have to understand, not all coaches do this. Nick and I don't know each other well. So, when I saw him in the last one-on-one, it was a little bit of a reintroduction. Oh yeah, I kind of know who you are, but where are you from again? And things like that. But he did ask so where are you from in New York? Just a couple of questions about me, just a little icebreaker stuff, a little small talk chit chat. And you think well, that's not a big deal. I'm telling you, some coaches don't do that. If you get 20 minutes in their office, okay, recorder's on, go. And as soon as 20 minutes is up, you're out. So the fact that Nick does that, I don't know if people who see his public persona and think of him as tough on media would think he would be that cordial in those settings, but he very much is. You'll talk to him for a couple of minutes about baseball, right? Because again, I'm from New York and he likes the Yankees, and we'll get into a little bit of that. He's definitely a little more cordial than maybe you'd expect from his public persona. Last thing on Alabama. We came into this season with the narrative that we have three elite teams: Alabama, Clemson, and Ohio State. They're sort of in tier one, and then there's everybody else. I am sensing, after watching Clemson and watching Ohio State and even Notre Dame and some other teams, that Alabama is inching away from the rest of its other tier. That's not to say we're going to hand them the championship right now, though maybe we should, because we're just flailing down the stretch here. But do you sense that Alabama right now, having seen all the other teams in that tier one, maybe distancing itself from the rest of tier one?
Yeah. And, after seeing, and I went to cover Ohio State, Indiana in person, and not that in person, you get a better feeling or anything, but I found myself even putting Ohio State maybe on a lower tier than even the others. So if you have Alabama pulling away from that group of three, it feels like to me that Notre Dame and Clemson are on a second tier, and then there's a third tier maybe with Ohio State. And I say that about Ohio State because of their defense, and how concerning I think it's been, not just against Indiana, the game I covered, but against Rutgers and even Penn State. I feel like the defensive issues that they have, especially in the secondary, is concerning. And so that's kind of how I view it. But I feel like I agree with you about Alabama. Just, it seems to be above and beyond all of the other teams. And it's clear their defense is starting to round in shape and match the offense. And it's just, you just don't, you watch them play and they just dominate. I mean, it's incredible what we've seen this year, despite COVID and all this stuff, when teams, didn't have spring and had an interrupted summer and all that stuff. What we're finding is, I think COVID is evening the playing field, and we've seen a lot more road upsets and underdogs winning, but Alabama just continues to dominate, and it feels like a normal season. They just continue to roll on. So yeah, they're clear cut number one. Now I think they'll get pushed against Florida in the SEC championship game, but to me right now they are clear number one.
Okay. Ross, are you good for another 15 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, cool. All right. Sarah, you can cut that part out. Okay. So 3, 2, 1. All right. I want to take a quick break. I'm talking with Ross Dellenger from Sports Illustrated. I'm going to come back and turn the subject to Ohio State. There's some news today to address with them. Maybe talk a little coaching carousel and maybe a little Heisman in there too. You're listening to the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast. Back right after this.
Hey, it's Michael Rosenbaum. You may remember me as Lex Luthor from the hit TV show Smallville. Regardless, I have this really cool podcast called Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum, where I get celebrities who are a lot more famous than me to really open up. Let's get inside of Jim Jeffries.
Oh, I never did anything with my life. I could have been a better son. Oh, God. I should apologize to this person.
So, join me on Inside of You with Michael Rosenbaum. New episodes drop every Tuesday. Listen on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your shows.
Back on the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast, Ralph Russo talking with Ross Dellenger from Sports Illustrated. So Ross, I broke in with the live news, quote unquote, live news of Ohio State getting some encouraging news that they're going to resume organized team activities. Now that might not necessarily put them on the practice field on Tuesday, but if they can resume activities on Tuesday and maybe get something that looks like a practice in on Wednesday, they should be able to play. The big news really in the playoff race is not who's number 1 and who's number 4, who's number 5. It's, will Ohio State play enough games to make the playoff? Not because there's a minimum on the playoff to get in, but because at a certain point, don't you think that you have to play X number of games to be judged properly? So now, again, encouraging that we might get to a point where they're going to play enough. They can't lose one more, but they seem to be on track to play this weekend. But as you look at this, do you think Ohio State can be shut out of a Big Ten title game and still make the playoff?
Yeah. In fact, I guess it won't bode better for them, but I do think it could happen. If they do, miss one more game and they'll end up maybe playing. I want to say they could play Wisconsin.
They could
finish the year.
Yep.
Yeah. And so they could get to 6-0, that route. It really would be hard, right, for the committee to leave out a 6-0 Big Ten champion named Ohio State. It would be hard. I would believe it when I see it that they would do that. I just think if Ohio State's schedule, I ran the numbers earlier this last week, and I don't have them in front of me now, but at one point their regular season opponents had a winning percentage of like 30%. Basically, they were like 10-22 or something like that. Now that's changed obviously since, but the bottom line is if they play those 6 games, I think 2 of the 6 probably will be wins against teams with a winning record.
Indiana and Wisconsin.
And Yeah, and then you've got that they're going to play half of the games, and they didn't play for a Big Ten championship. Gosh, it is mounting against them, but you just then, Ralph, I guess, have to look at the competitors. It would be a undefeated Cincinnati team. It would be a 9-1 Texas A&M team. Depending on what happens with Florida and Alabama, it could be a 1-loss Alabama or maybe a 2-loss Florida, although you would think that wouldn't happen. But I in that situation, I would think that they would put Ohio State in at 4, which I know that the Aggies, if they're 9-1, would absolutely raise all the hell possible, I'm sure. And honestly, they would be right to do it. They would have played 4 more games, and their only loss would have been to the number 1 team in the nation. I'm sure that is a scenario. And I know you do a lot of the scenarios every Sunday, which I love. The one's got to go. That would be the scenario that would be the worst, I would think, for the CFP committee is if they are deciding between a 6-0 Ohio State team that was shut out of its championship game against a 9-1 Texas A&M whose only loss is to number 1 Alabama. I would guess that would be the most difficult of all the situations. And then, of course, you throw in the whole Clemson Notre Dame thing too. If Notre Dame plays a really close game against Clemson, those teams would have split, and you would think that they would have to include Notre Dame in. But what if that game is a 30-point game? There's so many scenarios, but certainly the one that's going to come down to the selection committee making decisions on. I guess Ralph, it would be 2 of the 3, right? If you have a 9-1 A&M, an 11-1 Notre Dame, and a 6-0 Ohio State, you'd have to put, it would come down to 2 of those 3 getting in, and I'm sure that's a scenario the selection committee, I'm sure, does not want.
Yeah, I think the eye test will tell you that Ohio State is probably one of the 4 best teams in the country, though not without flaws, but they're just not going to be able to build up a resume. And you say, well, the best they can do is 7-0. So what's the difference if you lose 1 more game in 6-0? And I know you can kind of talk yourself into that. And I'm sure the selection committee might do just that, right? Like, well, what's the difference between 7-0 and 6-0? But I would say that no, every game does matter a lot when you're talking about these smaller sample sizes. It is the worst case scenario in some ways for the committee, because there's a path here for this thing to work itself out fairly easily. Like Ohio State goes undefeated, Notre Dame and Clemson play a relatively close game and Clemson wins. They both get in. Alabama does its thing and takes apart Florida. And then ta-da, we have our 4 teams. But Ohio State has become a weird wild card here because, will they play this week? Well, Michigan shut down its deal, right? And so if Michigan has a problem, that's Ohio State's next opponent. Like, it's not just Ohio State, it's their opponents who they can't lose games to. So, hey, man, it's the pandemic, but which also leads me to this. And that is like, it just seems like the Big Ten is hexed now, right? I mean, it's just like they came back and I do wonder if some of those Big Ten presidents are wondering, like, this is what we came back for, it just every move they have made has turned out to be the wrong move, whether it was wrong at the time or not, or just circumstances turned out to be the wrong move. Like, it just seems like no matter what they do, it turns out in the end, and with hindsight, oh yeah, that didn't work out either.
It is. I was talking to a group of 5 AD earlier this week who said what everybody else probably, at least outside the Big Ten and some probably inside the Big Ten, are thinking. And that's, the Big Ten has illustrated a way, what did he say? He said the Big Ten has, I guess, portrayed how not to make decisions, the best, and when you start from, they decided to cancel the season, and then they decided to play the season. And now, when they decided to play the season, they did it with such a rigorous set of protocols that felt like, to me, was almost designed to fail. They had no flexibility in their schedules, no bye weeks or anything like that. They had the 21-day mandatory suspension of players that were tested positive. And then they have the COVID rates on the team. It just felt like it was set up to fail, and now here we are, and they're, in a way, I guess they're failing. It's tough to really watch. It's like a car crash. It's tough, and believe me, I think people around the nation, specifically in the SEC, are chuckling under their breath in a lot of ways, or behind closed doors, and you hate to do that, and they would never do it publicly because we're in the middle of a pandemic, for crying out loud. But they are. It's just real. They're the decision making and the lack of patience, I think, from the Big Ten is making others just kind of giggle. But I will say this, what the other conferences decided isn't perfect either. I mean, everybody's having an issue here. I think the other conferences had flexibility, is what I think, and they showed some patience early on, and they had protocols that, you could say were a little more risky, but at the same time followed all the CDC. I mean, Big Ten went over and above the CDC stuff, and so it's just crazy, Ralph, that we're sitting here, and we might have Ohio State, out of the Big Ten championship game, and you've got maybe all but maybe 2 or 3 of the conference's teams have had a game impacted. Or a game canceled, I should say. It's crazy, and it's kind of unfortunate. And I think, I wonder myself what you said, are some Big Ten presidents going, man, we should have stuck with the guns, and we should have just played a spring season when this vaccine is going to roll out and all this, because we're seeing the spikes. And I was talking to Shane Lyons a few days ago. We're seeing the spikes that everybody thought we would see, and just having a brace for it. It's this uptick around the holidays and in the winter.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is we are lurching toward the end of the season. All the conferences are, again, the number of games that are getting postponed and canceled are going up all over. The problem with the Big Ten is it didn't give itself a window to do some makeups and to say, okay, this game doesn't matter that much, so we can just forget about it, but we'll move on and we'll give everybody a little leeway here. So it's as simple as that. All the conferences, trust me, nobody's doing a good job of keeping their players from getting infected except Boston College, right? Just about every other school has had outbreaks and issues and things along those lines. And again, Alabama's rolling along. There are a lot of teams that haven't necessarily had to go on pause, but in the grand scheme of things, what's happening in the Big Ten is not necessarily not happening in other places. It's just that the way all the decisions the Big Ten have made to come to this point have accentuated their problems, have accentuated all the negatives. And then, of course, like things away from COVID, like Michigan stinks, Penn State stinks, which leads to these other issues about like getting, just like we were talking about with Ohio State, right? Like, well, it's going to be like if Ohio State played 6 games, but Penn State was really good and Michigan was really good and Michigan State was pretty good. Like all of a sudden, like that sort of almost solves itself to a certain degree, but now that's out the window. And then like, well, Indiana is good, but like then poor Michael Penix, like it's even the things away from COVID on the field that it's just like everything that can go wrong for the Big Ten seems to be going wrong. It's not just Ohio State that gets eliminated or that is in danger of getting eliminated from the championship race because of COVID. Wisconsin is out. They've already lost 3 games, and that's your second best team in the conference. So again, it's just been one bad piece of bad news after the other for the Big Ten. They brought a lot of it on themselves by the way they've made decisions. Last thing, Ross, before I cut you loose out of here, and it's about the Heisman. And I have an interesting theory because right now it seems like Mac Jones and Kyle Trask are sort of running 1-2 here in the Heisman race. But I have a feeling that a lot of voters might still be swayed because Trevor Lawrence is the best player in the country. Like, I think that at a certain point, people might look at this and go, I know those guys got the better numbers, but I know which one's the better player, and he may have lost a couple of games. So just a quick wonder, like, where do you think this thing is going to land on as far as the Heisman's concerned?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you. The flashy kind of hot new names always kind of get the spotlight with Trask and Mac Jones, but Trevor's kind of, it's funny because he's only like 21 years old, but he's kind of the old man of the group and been hanging around now for a while, playing really well. And although he missed a couple of games, you're right. That hasn't changed that he's probably going to be the number one pick in the draft next year because he is the most talented, best overall player. And I think that if he keeps, if he plays well, keeps playing well down the stretch, that he ultimately he'll win that. He'll win that trophy. And I think part of it, I wonder, Ralph, but part of it's not going to be voters. And I vote in the Heisman, and I even have this sometimes come up. It's like, man, Trevor has deserved this. Mm-hmm. Is it finally time in his last year to give it to him, even though he missed a couple of games?
No, I agree. I think that it's not supposed to be a lifetime achievement, but I think at some point we look back on these guys and say, wait a second, this guy is not, we're going to let this guy leave college football without a Heisman trophy. I know I said that would be the last thing, but I did want to get one more thing because I promised the listeners this. Do you think Tom Herman's going to get fired? A real simple question for you.
God. Yeah, right. I know, right? I'm gonna lean toward no, but man, it wouldn't surprise me. It wouldn't surprise me at all, even though Texas had all these financial issues and cuts and budget cuts and furloughs and all that. I still think there's so much money over there with the boosters that it could happen. But right now on December 1, I'm leaning toward no, that they give him another year. But obviously going into next year, if they do give him another year, going into next year will be just about as do or die of a year as it gets.
Yeah, my lean on that is it's the front end. It's on the front end. It's if you can get Urban Meyer to be your next coach, then I think that I'd be interested to see what kind of work is done on the front end there. Because if not, if all you're doing is, and listen, I love Matt Campbell as a coach. I am a total honk for that guy. Like I will admittedly say, like, I think that guy's a great coach and I think he would be great at almost anywhere. But listen, all these guys are a little bit of a roll of dice. There are very few sure things. So if all you're doing is spending $24 million to get rid of Herman and his staff for another guy who's a little bit of a roll of a dice, that's a hard thing to sell. If it's Urban, it's not as much of a roll of dice. If it's somebody else, maybe it's best to not, burn that $24 million. And that's where I sort of am on this. Hey, Ross, man.
I agree. If you got to have somebody in the wings there, and that somebody would have to be Urban in order to, I think, in order to pull the trigger. But hey, crazy things happen. It's 2020, so who knows?
Ross, I appreciate you taking a lot of time to chat with me about all this stuff. Hey, done a great job this year covering what has been an absolutely batty year. I've said this among our colleagues and privately, but I don't know if I've said it to you. And I think a lot of our colleagues have done a really good job this year because it's been crazy and there's been a lot of stuff come down the pipe. But I will say this, I think you've done as good a job as anybody, if not the best job as anybody, of covering college football through a pandemic. So great work. Really appreciate you coming on. Really appreciate your friendship. And hey, stay safe on your travels. And hopefully maybe we get to bump into each other at a playoff game, or maybe not bump into each other. Maybe we can see each other. How about that? There's be no bumping into anybody these days, but hopefully we maybe get a chance to see each other at a playoff game. And I really admit it, you have been awesome this year in your work with just, again, covering this madcap year. You have been absolutely killing it.
Well, I appreciate it, man. It means a lot for you to say that. And obviously I enjoy reading everything you do. And You guys do a great job. Always lean on the AP, man. Always the sure thing, So I appreciate you saying that, though, and it was great to be on with you.
Take care, Ross. Thanks a lot, man.
Yep.
Now, 3 and out. First down. Often when the schedule is lacking obvious big games, it produces some of the craziest results. So we can look at this week's college football schedule and hope. But folks, I think we're going to have to find our entertainment this week away from the playoff and conference championship races. Maybe, for example, Penn State at Rutgers could be interesting because the Scarlet Knights have been much improved in year 1 under Greg Schiano, part 2. Meanwhile, there is a path for Penn State to finish with enough victories to get everybody in Happy Valley to calm down, maybe just a little bit, and shrug off that 0-5 start as an anomaly. I'm curious to watch UCLA play with the Bruins 2-2 and visiting an Arizona State team that has missed 3 straight games. Is Chip Kelly's program coming around, or is it just taking advantage of some unusual circumstances in an unusual year? Over in the MAC, what will Buffalo's Jarrett Patterson do this week after he ran for 300 yards 2 weeks ago and 409 yards and 8 touchdowns last week? The Bulls play Ohio this week. Second down, the bowl lineup is down to 34 games as of this recording. Reportedly, the Sun Bowl, one of the oldest postseason games in college football, was canceled. The game takes place in El Paso, and the Texas city has been hit especially hard by COVID-19. So that community has far more important things to deal with right now than putting on a bowl game. Related, the Pac-12 has now lost half of its bowl tie-ins and is down to 4. Over the weekend, the Pinstripe Bowl at Yankee Stadium also was called off for this year. That's a Big Ten ACC game. Hard to guess how many more bowl games might bail on the postseason, but it's probably not a bad thing that some are going away now if you look at the big picture. Allow me to explain. A deep bowl lineup will require some fringy teams to accept bowl bids. Teams with losing records or borderline 500 records, I think it's going to be hard to convince some of those teams to go through another week or so of COVID protocols to travel to play a game that won't have any of the usual bowl trip add-ons. I was talking with an athletic director who basically said, yeah, like I'm using this as the carrot. Like, hey, win our last game or two, finish with X record, and we can get to a bowl game. We might get that bowl game anyway, this athletic director said, but I just don't know if my players are going to be into it at 4-6 or 5 and whatever. Another coach said something similar that, hey, we're having such a good season and I'm pretty sure we're going to finish with enough wins that my players will be excited to go. But if we had stumbled down the stretch, I'm not sure if we were going to be able to sell it to the kids. Hey, stay away from your families for another 2, 3, 4 weeks. You know, probably only 2 or 3 weeks really in those the type of bowl games that his team would be talking about. But stay away from your family and keep your life as rigid as it is now, just so we can go play in a bowl game with only 4 or 5 wins. I think that mentality is around a lot of college football, but because there are less bowl games, there'll be less of those teams in the position to make those type of decisions. I think less bowl games will mean you'll mostly have winning teams and teams that will be enthusiastic about trying to play if they can. This bowl season will be an interesting balance, basically, of trying to find teams that can and want to play, pairing them with games that want to and can be put on in a way that is both safe and, important, cost-effective. Third down. Only in current America could the story of Vanderbilt kicker Sarah Fuller create faux controversy or quote-unquote critics. Unless you have been under a rock, you know Fuller kicked for Vanderbilt last weekend and became the first woman to play in a Power 5 football game. She kicked off in the second half. Vandy didn't get close enough to the end zone to give her a chance to score some points against Missouri, so that was her only appearance of the game. Just to make sure the facts are clear here, Fuller is the goalkeeper on Vandy's SEC championship soccer team. Vandy needed to find an emergency kicker because of COVID issues. Vandy needed someone who was already in COVID protocols, so no open tryouts. Plus, even if they wanted to, it's Thanksgiving. Most of the students were heading home. Also, Vandy does not have a men's soccer team. The Vandy special teams coach said earlier this week that they tried some of the players on the current football team who had said, they played soccer or kicked a little bit in high school. And the coach said those guys were awful. Fuller was the best option. And apparently she still is, because as of this afternoon, Tuesday afternoon, when Vandy put out its depth chart, Sarah Fuller is listed as the starting kicker and the only kicker heading into the Georgia game for the Commodores. If nothing else, Fuller should be praised for having the guts to give this a try. Think about it. How many people would sign up to do something they have never done before, but in a very public setting, to voluntarily put themselves in a position to fail on national TV, not to mention also risk getting crushed by a charging football player while you're doing that thing? So I don't know, folks. Seems like a pretty easy story to appreciate. That's the show for today. I'd like to thank my producer, Sarah McCrory, for making me sound good. You can find this podcast on Apple Podcasts and Westwood One Podcast. Please subscribe so you do not miss an episode. I'm Ralph Russo, the college football writer with the Associated Press. Thanks for listening. Come back for more next week of the AP Top 25 College Football Podcast.